we looked at the relationship between prevalence and support for different types of interventions, and in particular in the case of food, prevalence as measured by the proportion of adults in the country with a BMI over 30, so into the obese categories, it didn't seem to be related to people's tendency to support bans on unhealthy food. Whereas I think from memory, in the case of smoking, countries with high prevalence of smoking did tend to support more forceful interventions in relation to smoking. These are just some of the more interesting findings from this data, and I'm just going to wrap up with a couple of points to conclude. It should be noted that though public support may play some role in the chance of certain interventions succeeding, focusing on whether or not a measure passes some kind of public acceptance test sort of misses the point that acceptance is more of a process than a state. And we can certainly think of many examples in which public acceptance for an intervention followed way after the implementation of what at the time was a fairly unpopular measure. So, for example, mandatory seatbelt wearing or public smoking bans. And the high levels of support might be related to other factors and don't necessarily guarantee compliance. So in the case of China, for example, there tends to be very high support for bans on smoking. However, there's very, very low compliance with that measure. And so I think some of the findings from this data should be looked at in light of the fact that there may be a tendency among certain cultures to support or to agree with certain statements. And while acceptability provides a crude measure of the level of resistance the governments might be working against when they're trying to implement more forceful policies, it might be more useful to focus on the idea of public preparedness for an intervention, which is a bit of a more complex concept, but it looks at measuring things like the recognition of the issue as a problem by the community, understanding of the benefits of addressing it, acceptance of the role of government in addressing that issue, and a belief in the effectiveness of the intervention that's been proposed. And there is an actual publication associated with this piece of research, and we do have copies of it by the door. It does go into a lot more detail than I have. I've only sort of touched on some of the findings in it. And we also do hold while this is a global report, we do also hold the data for Australia as well. So if anyone is interested in looking in more detail at any of the findings specifically in relation to Australia, then we can certainly put that out. Thank you.